We've got an august panel here, and I'm going to let the moderator, Lieutenant General retired Dick Formica, introduce the group here. General Formica has been a longtime moderator for our events, and I'll let him take over and introduce the panel. Dick, go ahead.
General Swan, thank you. Good morning, everybody. Good morning. I would like to begin by thanking AUSA, not only for hosting this event, but more importantly for what it does every day for our Army, for its soldiers and civilians, and for our families. So to Lieutenant General Guy Swan and Lieutenant General Pat McQuistion, thank you for all that. As Guy said, with the great keynotes remarks from General Dickinson, General Brown, we're off to a great start on this very important topic. This is always an important topic, and I think given the current environment, especially so at this time. The transition to the concepts and evolving doctrine of multi-domain operations and the relevant role that both space and air and missile defense play in it make this a worthwhile topic for discussion today. So we're pleased to kick off the panel presentations. AUSA always does a great job assembling panels. This one is a strong panel, well assembled, and perfect for the discussion at hand. Following General Brown's discussion, this panel is total Army, combined arms, joint, and we even have a think tank thrown in just to keep us honest. I'll introduce the panel here in a second. We're assembled to address the topic of air and missile defense integration in multi-domain operations. And Major General Gary Brito, our panel chair, asked the panel members to also talk to that within the context of large-scale ground combat operations. So with that, let me introduce our panel, and this is the order in which they'll talk. They have about 3 to 5 minutes. The 5-minute mark, I'm cutting them off at the knees. And that should leave about 25 minutes for your questions, and it's your questions we want to get to. So, panel chair, Major General Gary Brito, the CG of the U.S. Army Maneuver Center of Excellence in Fort Benning, Georgia. He'll be followed by Brigadier General Clem Coward, the CG of the 32nd Army Air and Missile Defense Command. Brigadier General Frank Rice, the Deputy Commanding General of the 263rd Army Air and Missile Defense Command. Colonel Dave Shank, the commander of the 10th Army Air and Missile Defense Command in Europe. Colonel Tim Welter, who's a division chief in the Air Force Warfighting Integration Capability, Headquarters, United States Air Force. And then to close up our ranks, Dr. Tom Karako, Senior Fellow and the Director of the Missile Defense Project at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS. So with that, I'll turn it over to our panel chair, General Brito. Thank you, sir.
Sir, thank you for the warm introduction, and AUSA and all the panel members, thank you for the opportunity as well. I feel very privileged to have been on 2 of these hot topics, the first one being aviation, and the second one being air missile defense, and I'm starting to wonder if I need some retraining now. We'll see what's going to be next. You can tell by looking at the uniforms civilians included on the panel today, and the uniforms in front of us to include our multinational partners, that our success as an Army in conducting maneuver and multi-domain operations is clearly going to be part of the joint force in a joint multinational fight, which really gets to the definition of convergence. I'd like to go to the first slide, please, since I do only have 3 to 5 minutes, and like to add.
You have 10. You can take as long as you want.
But the card here says 3 to 5 minutes, so I'll stick to that, sir. But more importantly, just for a little bit of context, and much of it was discussed, some of it was discussed from our 2 guest speakers early in the morning. It's very clear that our character war has changed, which I would say has clearly defined over the last 10, 15 years the operational environment of which all of us are going to fight, an Army, a joint force, and our multinational partners. And our MDO doctrine, both versions of which continue to be refined, clearly identifies 4 interrelated trends. And you can see the bullets there. I won't go through all of them. But every aspect of our warfighting functions, every maneuver force, maneuver formation, will have to have some level of expertise or comfortability across these domains. And in some cases, master all of them. It's very clear that we will continue to face an increasing lethal and expanded battlefield. It could be in rural sprawl, urban terrain, subterranean terrain, mega cities, as General Brown mentioned, and I would argue, which is a big challenge for us as well, fighting in an urban environment, which talks to some of the lethality and equipment that we're going to face. And it will continue to challenge our strategic deterrence capability, a comfort of which we have enjoyed really up until the enemy, our threats, continue to study as has evolved. I'd like to shift over to the modernization right side of the slide, left as you look at it. This was touched upon as well in General Brown's comments, our 6 modernization priorities. And what I'd like to really touch on is, one, the intellectual and the fiscal financial investment that has been made in all these priorities, which is very, very good. And more importantly, although for the context of this briefing, I highlighted the air and missile defense, I would argue from a maneuver perspective, and looking back at my old infantry hat per se, there's truly a nexus across all of these priorities, and none of them will succeed by themselves. And the threat that we will face in the multi-domain environment, multi-domain operations, and this current COE, current operational environment, really demands a nexus between those 6 priorities. Our Army is tackling that, as touched upon in the multi-domain task force, and the cross-functional teams, largely led by leaders or leaders in our centers of excellence. And this has really given a new dynamic and a new challenge to our professional military education in the way we write doctrine and the way we have to write it quickly. From a big idea to a concept, big idea to reality, concept doctrine, and all the Dahlem PF aspects that support that. Next slide, please. And what's this all about? I know many of us have had the opportunity to read our MDO. Many have sat through some of the AUSA briefings and others. But long and short of it, this is about layered standoff, and our threats have a layered standoff. To borrow a peer of mine analogy, you're watching a boxing fight, one guy has a 37-inch reach, one guy has a 28-inch reach, 28-arm reach. You're going to fight. It's going to be tough to get within this 38-inch reach, and it's going to continue to be a challenge. And I would argue, as rightly so, when we were engaged in wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, and other places, our adversaries, our threats had time to study us, look at our doctrine, look at the way we fight, and more importantly, made some investments and changes the way they fight, which has created this challenge that we have in layered standoff. The topic of convergence was discussed earlier, and I would offer that this brings to us the necessity of working with our joint partners, and the Army being effective as a joint force and working with the sister services as well. Many ways to define it, but I would offer up it is simply an alignment of capabilities to develop a greater output, to include some of the specifics with their defense. If you shift down to the bottom half of the slide, our Army now, through our MDO doctrine, is tackling this challenge of layered threats and layered standoff through the moniker of compete, penetrate, disintegrate, exploit, and recompete. I won't talk to all of them in detail, but the compete really puts us at 2 big challenges, and we have 2 big ideas. Our threat has 2 big ideas. Compete aggressively below the threshold of armed conflict. It was mentioned before, really no such thing as phase 0, because that does imply in some aspects there's nothing going on, but there's clearly a lot, whether it's through the DIME principles, cyber, other activities, which may be a little less kinetic than what many of us may be used to, but nonetheless, very much a threat and threatens our ability to be successful in the compete phase. Secondly, I would offer the next big idea is our threat works to present multiple layers of standoff, strategic through to tactical, to keep us at an arm's length. And you can hook that back to the boxing analogy. And to keep us at an arm's length, we won't have an A-level expertise or dominance across any of the domains. Within the compete phase, certain aspects are critical. One, we are enabling success and enabling deterrence, and also setting the conditions for transition, which can bring us to the penetration phase, which in some aspects may be more kinetic, but I'll offer up as well, leveraging the capabilities across all the domains as a U.S. force, as a joint force, a key in the penetration as well, and it allows us to get within that 38-inch reach that I talked about as well. Last one I'll talk to, and the rest are relatively self-explanatory, and I'm going to use some of the words of my predecessor in this job. The dash and disintegrate is very key. Some could define it as atomize, all the aspects of the threat, all that would be very good. But the dash and disintegrate is very important, and that we're really eroding his capabilities to integrate his capabilities against us. So taking all that apart, leveraging his disadvantage, and allowing us to compete, penetrate, exploit, disintegrate his capabilities, exploit, and recompete as stated there. And next slide, please, and my last one. Now, how are we going to do this? Of course, the topic of this panel is focused on the air missile defense, but as a maneuver force, and it's gone of the days of just the infantry and the army doing the maneuver alone, infantry, army, and fire support doing the maneuver alone. All of our warfighting functions are indeed integrated, and to put it in simple grunt terms, we must rapidly and continuously integrate all domains. It's clearly you have to execute the key components of deterrence, and integrate all of our warfighting functions faster and better than the adversary can, to keep him at arm's length, to keep him off his feet, to erode his capability to converge all his aspects of his warfighting functions, whether it's pre-phase zero, using that term lightly, whether it's in the compete phase, or simultaneously with all these phases and all these domains as well. Long and short, consistently present multiple dilemmas across all the domains all the time, so that he cannot compete and he cannot move and fight faster than we can. And with that, I'll yield to my battle buddy to the right.
Sir, thank you, and I think it's a pretty good segue, particularly as General Dickinson talked about us just coming out of the 32nd Double AMDC, coming out of Roving Sand. So I'm Clement Coward, the CG of the 32nd, as we violently executed Phase 3 operations with against the Denovian forces, and as we're moving into Phase 4 and 5, and we still have over 2,000 soldiers still out at Fort Bliss as they go through retrograde operations, really executing those deployment muscles as we talked about earlier on being ready to go today. And I'll try to walk you through this slide pretty quick here. And this is a 4.5-month assessment of the time that I've been in command. And if you look on, the current state, that's really where we're at today. And I think many of you, if not most of you, understand, that's how we do operations. But if you look to the far right, that is the final CPOF, one of the CPOF snapshots that we were able to take, and that's where we need to go. The desired end state, as we look at the Secretary of the Army and the Chief of Staff of the Army's balance in order to defeat and go up against a competitor of nature like China or Russia by 2022, we have to get to the right, and this is how we're going to really increase our readiness posture. I think most of you know, and you'll hear from Dave Shank as well, the double AMDC, we wear 3 hats. And, in our cases here, we command all ADA forces. In our case here, we have all the forces in CONUS. Serve as the Deputy Area Air Defense Commander for a CFAC or a JFAC, and then as a Theater Air Missile Defense Coordinator. And then for the 32nd's case, we provide forces for the entire globe, which was demonstrated and displayed earlier by General Dickinson. If you look at the stance, 5 CONUS locations that provide forces for the assigned missions abroad. And I'm not going to go through each and every one of them, and I have a few charts here. If you can't read it clearly, if you want to get with me afterwards, these are unclassified. We've been in the static fight, and as General Brito and General Brown said, we're really not in Phase 0. It's shaping operations, but I would tell you that we're pretty good at it, okay? But we're very comfortable at doing that mission overseas in the CENTCOM AOR. And we're pretty good at integrating with AFCENT, RCENT, and even CENTCOM, as we wear these 3 different hats out there. And what we've also done a pretty good job of is reinvigorating our partnership capacity with the GCC countries over there. And that's important. As they continue to build their capacity, at the end of the day, how do we work ourselves out of a job? How do we work this integration piece? And how do they potentially protect certain sites that we've been nested in for over several years? I kept the modernization piece really as a neutral, because we have to do this out of hide. We don't have a real dedicated test battalion. It's one of our battalions that we assign a test mission to, and I'll talk just a couple seconds about that afterwards when it comes to modernization. But if you go down to the negatives, these are the skills that have atrophied. Okay, we no longer have core air defense brigades. We no longer do brigades that do core warfighters, and we have to start doing this again, and that's something that has atrophied over time. The experience base, the senior folks who did have that experience are starting to age out of the military. Now, how do we inculcate that back with our younger generation of leaders? And so the assigned missions that we continue to do in the CENTCOM AOR certainly inhibits your ability to go through those shoot, move, communicate type muscle building exercises while you're deployed. If you look through the transition piece of it, what I will tell you, we are, the 32nd, are just as much part of the conversation when it comes to the reposture of CENTCOM. The decisions and the announcement that were made about Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan have implications as well to the Missile Defense Force. As we reduced even one battalion over there, there's discussion, is that going to be the last state, or are we going to continue to go to reduce even more? And that's the conversations that we have to continue to do in order to get to this 2022 stance out there. Force modernization, we have to do it. It's important. Once again, I said it's something that we have to do out of hide, and it's absolutely vital. Dynamic force employment, as Dave Shank just received the THAAD battery for his region, we are the capability and capacity that certainly will enable that concept from our Secretary of Defense as well as our Chairman of the Joint Staff. We talked about roving sands, and I tell you, I really commend my predecessor, Chris Spillman, for breaking that glass, getting out there, taking a hard look at ourselves, and he would be very proud to see all the improvements that were made in just a year's time or a short period of time. But we do have ways to go, and it goes back to now we are starting to build that readiness. We have the 2nd Brigade that just went through. We now have 6 of the 11 battalions that are assigned to the 32nd Double Aim, Patriot battalions assigned to the 32nd Double AMDC, that now we're able to start building that readiness. And what we're here to really discuss is, as the Air Defense Force, we really have to master that air and land domain in order to understand cyber, space, information, and maritime. And in order to do that, it goes back to the piece that I started off with. How we're going to do that is doing the really hard stuff, coordinating with our large-scale ground combat maneuver forces. We got to get back into the warfighters, and we can't just assume that we're going to be in these locations where we're on a base or any other FOB out there that doesn't require the detailed coordination and movement across the full spectrum. So with that, like I said, I appreciate the time here, your questions, and this is how we're aiming to get after multi-domain operations. Thank you very much.
Good morning. I'm Brigadier General Frank Rice, Second 263rd. I'm also dual-hatted out at the FCO as the Army National Guard DCG for Air Defense Artillery. Major General Sheriff sends his regards. He couldn't be here. The 2nd 263rd was assigned to NORAD Northcom in 2015. OPCON to U.S. Army North and direct support to all 3 regions, CANAR, ANAR, and CONAR. We plan, coordinate, and execute training, readiness oversight activities in support of 1st Army for all the units that support Homeland Defense missions, MDP and DIADS. And the MDP and DIADS readiness prep for support of all of the national special security events are included in that. We're standing up a ASMD RAC, Airspace and Missile Defense RAC, to tackle key strategic issues, including modernization, TAA, talent management, life cycle management inherent to all the GMD forces, and I'm briefing that to GOAC tomorrow. We've got 3 ADA brigades in the reserve component, 678th, 174th, and the 164th out of Florida. We're very busy with the NCRID's Task Force C2. South Carolina's up there. Colonel Donnie Wilson's in the crowd. He's our task force commander for the NCRID's mission this rotation. And they're also doing the MCE, Mission Command Element rotations to UCOM. So they've got a brigade minus set. General Dickinson talked about it a little bit this morning, and we're getting after helping the 10th Double AMDC with command and control, putting that proper layer in between Double AMDC and the maneuver forces. The 174th ADA Brigade, Ohio National Guard, led by Colonel Tom Moore, is in the seat right now over there at the MCE. He's C2 and 5.7 Patriot, and all the other radar efforts that are in theater. And y'all know most about those. Side note, Lieutenant Colonel John Wilson is out at from South Carolina. He works for us at 263rd, or has. He is commanding Air Defense Combined Task Force Defenders, comprised of both the U.S. and Republic of Korea soldiers in Indo-PACOM. He's working for the 35th ADA Brigade. We've got 7 Army National Guard battalions. They're doing great work maintaining readiness, homeland defense, CTC rotation, that sort of stuff. We're getting back. We're learning a lot from our EDI rotations, our European Deterrence Initiative rotations, and just like General Coward talked about, we're learning that what we don't know, what we have forgotten, and it's fieldcraft stuff. It's all the stuff that we hadn't been doing while we've been rotating for the past 14 years through the NCR. We recently received approval for a 5-year SRM sustainable readiness model. It's going to help us program our training days and funding and we get the extra days. We programmed it so that we get the extra days in years 3 and 4. So it's working out for us too. 174th. 1st and 174th Ohio Army National Guard is currently supporting the Homeland Defense NCR IADS and EDI missions right now. EDI battery, the European Deterrence Initiative. Like I said, the Charlie batteries, 1st and 174th is over there. They took over from Charlie 2nd to 263rd in November, and they're continuing to train, figuring out what they don't know. I mean, down into the perishable skills like fieldcraft, noise and light discipline, map reading, and night land nav, NVG stuff. You know, things that if you're riding around in a city, you really hadn't had to have to do a lot of. These guys are back at Grafenwehr, getting at it. Across the board, brigade, battalion level planning and integration skills have been lost, and these missions are helping us out to get those skills back. I'll submit the rest of my time.
Thanks, sir. Good morning, General Officers, ladies and gentlemen. I couldn't think of a better seat to put me in than between General Rice and, of course, our joint partners. Everything we do in Europe, no different than elsewhere around the globe, is a total Army effort, as just the story was just told by General Rice. And then, of course, we're 5 kilometers down the road from Ramstein Air Base, and I'm sure most of us in this room have been there, and we understand what takes place at Ramstein. I just want to talk about probably 5 highlights this morning. Growth, setting the theater, our allies and our partners, modernization, and then the greatest challenge that we face is interoperability, which has been discussed several times already. Just briefly on the growth piece, we are set, and we are waiting on a 1-star general on July 10th to backfill me, and the 10th double AMDC will be set and look very similar to the other 2 double AMDCs in the active component force. But the 1-star general who is inbound is not the sole survivor or the sole piece to the success of our formation. I know we were the first double AMDC, and General Coward, sir, I don't know if you've received a strategist yet, but it's guys like this FA-59 that's just knocking down targets and hitting the ball every time he comes to the plate. It's the attack operations section that are doing what they're paid to do, and briefing General Walters, the U-Safety commander, when required, to talk about dynamic and deliberate targeting. You know, it's the IG, it's the lawyer we're going to receive this summer, and so forth. So the growth on the command and the staff piece is on glide path, and we look forward to the 1-star general's arrival. We talked about the total Army effort and the 88 Brigade headquarters, the MCE elements that are coming out of the Army National Guard, what the team from South Carolina, first team in, never the easiest, but they set the conditions. 174th 88 Brigade from the great state of Ohio is on the ground now, They are now providing that tactical level mission command that didn't exist previously, so I'm no longer signing E4 waivers and then having a meeting with General Cavoli or Lieutenant General Riggi, and I can push that down. But more importantly, and as General Coward mentioned, with the dynamic force employment, it's Tom Moore, it's Command Sergeant Major Chambliss who are leading the effort in Israel right now with the dynamic force employment. So they're doing exactly what they were sent to Europe to do. They're executing that mission set, and they're continuing to execute day-to-day and steady-state operations up in Germany and across Europe, for that matter. And then lastly, the piece is 5480A. We talked briefly about the first Short-Range Air Defense Battalion back in the active component, and Todd Daniels and Command Sergeant Major Palmer. They are building combat power as we speak. They've transitioned from individual to crew training, and they will very quickly move into collective training. And their first big event will be in May at Putlos. For those that have been stationed in Germany, we're gonna bring Putlos back into our lexicon and execute some aerial gunnery there, and then they will participate in the Sabre series in the June time frame. Really, all this means is the relevance that exists now back in Europe, and the ability to demonstrate the capability on the battlefield. Of course, we have the 173rd, the 2nd CR, the non-dedicated Stinger teams that still exist, and just want to echo something General Brito mentioned and General Rice is while we're bringing back the SHORAD capability, we're also educating the rest of the Army. We're seeing this up close and personal, and it's these battery commanders, these European Deterrence Initiative battery commanders that are really facing that fight. And they're taking it to the rest of the Army and working the education piece. And I think it drives home the importance of how we're manning our Atom cells, because those individuals alone are now the face of the Air Defense Branch and must have that ability to speak short-range air defense specifically during this time. Setting the theater, again, it overlaps with the growth piece. The 80A Brigade, 5480A, they're both located in Ansbach. 54, as mentioned earlier, is at Shipton, Kaserne. So doing great and wonderful things there. But the support that we've received as we stood up both those formations from PDC RAM, Cruise Missile Defense Agency, PEO Missiles in Space, and so forth, as we've gone through new equipment training, new equipment fielding, and so forth, and ensuring that we're standing this unit up right the first time as we continue to work through the training methodology. And then the last piece, just with regards to setting the theater and getting it right, is the training and the exercises piece. And of course, within the exercises, those are the live fire exercises as well. And I'll come back to that shortly. But the Sabre series, the Defender series that'll take place in 2020, the Juniper series, we just finished Juniper Falcon, and as the DFE was announced that THAAD would move to Israel, sometimes it's better to be lucky than good. And we were actually there in Israel executing a joint RSOI exercise, Juniper Falcon, and we literally put it to the test as we worked hand in hand with 32nd Double AMDC and 11th ADA Brigade, and we set conditions to deploy the THAAD battery and the enablers from both CONUS and across Europe to where we're at today. Number 3 is the allies and partners, and the foot stomp has been said several times. We will not do this alone, and we recognize that clearly from our foxhole. And it's not just about the U.S. Building the capability and the capacity, but it's about our allies and our partners, whether it's in the Baltics or down in the Black Sea region or up in the Scandinavian countries. The countries that are spending money clearly are committed, not just by spending the money, but they're committed. They're engaged. I know they're attending some of the schools at Fort Sill already. But they're also part of our formation, and we bring them down. We conduct short-term exchange programs to ensure that we're open kimono and we answer any questions they may have. And then in January, someone mentioned to him earlier, we hosted an international IAMD conference. Wasn't sure how this thing was going to turn out, but and I wanted to prevent that it wasn't a red, white, and blue stars and stripes conference. And so we had a great turnout from our allies and our partners, and they were participants and guest speakers to support that conference. So very, very well done by their part. Just quickly through the modernization piece, not to talk about what we've already fielded. We're looking at a little more training with the Enhanced Target Acquisition Kit, the ETAC, in June as we bring that out to the field. And so we're not going to try to break it, but we're going to put it through a ringer to ensure that it's up to the standard of being moved around the battlefield and have that capability to fire a Stinger missile at night under all weather conditions. But as mentioned, the IBCS, 360-degree radar, decoys were mentioned earlier. And I say that, and I look at the industry partners that are here, and that's where we need your help to help us get through that. And I've said it before, please talk to our young soldiers, talk to my command sergeant major, my senior warrant officer that's here, CW5 Cleese, and help us recognize what some of those challenges are and what we need by having those discussions. And really the focus is we figure out how to make them cheaper and how to get faster and field it faster. And then the last piece is the interoperability. Everything we do is centered around interoperability. We only conduct one bilateral exercise, and that's with our Israeli partners. But everything else is no less than my rule is no less than 5 countries, and because we've got to figure out how to tie in Soviet era sensors and shooters with 21st century sensors and shooters, and it's not easy. It's very challenging, and we do this again through the mentioned exercises I said earlier. In closing, thanks for having me. Thanks for letting me come. We recognize the challenges, but what it comes down to is the readiness across the front, and of course the greater lethality that again, not just the U.S. but as a joint combined force we bring to the fight every day. Thanks.
Thanks for having me. Really appreciate the invitation and to be the guy on the panel that makes it joint this morning. So I'll try to do my best to that end. But seriously, thank you, General Formica, and thank you to AUSA for inviting me here today. Those of you that are not familiar with AFWC, the Air Force Warfighting Integration Capability, we essentially have the same charter, the same responsibility that Army's Future Command has been and that is future design of the Air Force and enterprise-wide integration. So we're working on making that a reality in what's relatively new organization in the Air Force. To that end, General Formica asked me to talk today a little bit about an opportunity that AFWC, along with joint partners, had a couple weeks ago at a Title X War Game Futures Game 2019. We had an opportunity to test some of those potential future force design attributes that we've been looking at. Basically, how are we going to fight in the future? And some of those key takeaways off the top, I'll share with you. First, that the conclusions that underpin the National Defense Strategy's approach to future conflict were reinforced to a degree. We also gained a better understanding of how informationalized warfare will likely be used against us. And to that end, if you didn't see Lieutenant General Mike Dana's War on the Rocks article this past week on the 6th, I commend you to that because it was instructive to that end. We also saw clear indications that perhaps the most important modernization priority for our joint forces is multi-domain command and control, which is apropos why we're, for this discussion. And then finally, we must reassess the costs associated with basing in all forms to include base defense. And that's what I'm going to talk a little bit about more here. So a little bit about what the attributes we considered in our future force design alternatives at Futures Game with regard to air-based missile defense. First of all, overall, I think we all understand that our potential adversaries have quite extensive quivers, which may require multiple integrated systems to effectively engage threats from a range of distances, something weighing on us very much overall. To that end, we wanted to revisit and think about and talk about who is and should be responsible ultimately for air-base air defense. should it be left to where we're at today, or is there a better solution for all of us, for the Joint Force, for the Air Force, for the Army overall? So one of the things that we looked at, should base defense be directed by the base commander, which would require effective command and control, perhaps a base defense operations center to sync data and coordinate between counter cyber, counter UAS, counter air, counter ground squadrons to provide some kind of comprehensive base defense scheme. Per my first point, a layered air and missile defense would likely require multiple systems optimized against multiple threats, which could be cost prohibitive depending on how you do that. So part of what we were doing, therefore, is looking at models and testing, and this was a beginning of that, to understand what that optimal defense portfolio, what those systems might look like. To that end, this integrated defense system might use a prioritized threat list to employ each appropriate system in a layer against a given threat and deconflict itself via an associated layered radar sensing system to ensure acquisition and track of all inbound threats, again, on the joint level, not necessarily just at the service level by any means. It's paramount. Essentially, we were trying to figure out, how to build and maintain a reverse kill chain. How do you ensure acquisition, track, and shoot down from max acquisition range to rely on to ensure a minimum engagement zone, given the vast missile threat that we're facing? How do you complicate targeting using maneuver, dispersion, spoofing, hiding, in order to defeat the exquisite, expensive, and multiple missiles that our potential adversaries have with minimum cost, and influence the enemy's calculus, doing it all along the way. So I look forward to your questions. Again, this is a journey that we're on, and I appreciate, again, being invited and participating today. Thanks.
Thank you. I want to hit really three things. First, talking a little bit about kind of the magnitude of change and the need to break China in adapting air and missile defense operations. Second, I want to talk really about passive defense. And then third, and finally, especially air and missile defense sensors. So to begin with the first part about the magnitude of change, this is a nice quote from Acting Secretary of Defense Shanahan in the preface of the Missile Defense Review. He talks about the scale and urgency of change required to adapt to today's environment, especially because we've taken things for granted, he said. We've taken military superiority for granted, and perhaps more than anything else, air superiority. It's not just about rogue states anymore, and it's not just about ballistic missiles. As General Brown this morning talked about, it's very much the combination, the wicked combination of all aspects along the air and missile threat spectrum, and they're bringing them together in terms of complex and integrated attack. Unfortunately, of course, today's force, relative to that, is all too susceptible to suppression. And so multi-domain operations for the Army, distributed lethality for the Navy, all of these are trying to deal with this problem. This brings me to the second quote up there. And this is from the Missile Defense Review as well, but I think it's gotten very little attention and very little implementation in terms of the Missile Defense Review, and that's about passive defense, distribution, dispersal, all this sort of stuff. General Dickinson, I've heard speak about this many times in terms of emissions control, and General Brown did as well this morning. I'll suggest that the Missile Defense Review attempts to adapt our air and missile defense operations to the central challenge of the day. But in a very real sense, it falls short of endorsing and implementing the scale and urgency of change required for the BMDS broadly, and especially in terms of air defense. It's almost absent from that document. The final quote on this page might surprise you. It's from about a week ago, the Russian Chief of the General Staff, General Gerasimov. Now, he was probably talking about information operations or something else, but I like the quote. He's suggesting the Pentagon is really up to a Trojan horse. And I'll suggest that that's a kind of a good metaphor for how we might think about adapting our air and missile defense operations. Next slide, please. So over the last 2 years, the CSIS missile defense program has been exploring the concept of distributed operations for air and missile defense. And at this event last year, I talked about especially the central column and the top of the left-hand column in terms of what the shortcomings are. Stovepipes of excellence, really a lack of integration, interoperability. Too many single points of failure. Insufficient attention to non-ballistic threats, and way too few aim points, all of which kind of is the opposite of distribution and leads to the threat of suppression. And that central column that I talked about are sort of some notional concepts for distributed fires. We put out a report on that about 1.5 years ago. Using network centrism and integration as the foundation opens up all manner of element dispersal, mixed loads, think the MML concept or the VLS, offense, defense, mix in a single launcher, and so on. But also it could permit containerized launchers and really a passive defense shell game. Reminds me a little bit of that Gerasimov quote. Now that's largely about launchers and effectors. And so today I want to turn as well to the principle of what we might call distributed sensors. In missile defense circles, commentators frequently talk about there's not enough islands or ships in the Pacific on which to put big radars. And yet for many years, the last 15 years, we've been doing largely that strategy. Call it the radar archipelago. We've had too much sectored coverage, terrestrial rather than elevated basing, too many emissions, an over-reliance on radio frequency. Vice Chief Selva has been emphasizing that. Insufficient integration with non-integrated assets, think F-35 and other things. And so the last column here is some ideas for what we might think of moving beyond the radar archipelago and towards a kind of new sensor roadmap. Above all, upwards from terrestrial to elevated sensors, lots of disaggregation and dispersal, more technological diversity, and a culture change with opportunistic fusing of data rather than dedicated alone, and advanced radar capabilities. So I'm going to leave it right there, but I think that we've heard about the strategy for 2028, and I think actually there's a good chance that that will stimulate some movement and thinking beyond where the Missile Defense Review left us.
Thank you, gentlemen. Before we go to questions, I'd like to offer one more thing, and both our refined understanding of the operational environment, the work of the modernization priorities, cross-functional teams as well, and an analysis of how our Army fights from the tactical end of the combat training centers to the higher strategic end through our warfighting exercises and other network exercises, and a dry erase board on how our Army needs to look in order to be successful and be organized to be successful in multi-domain operations. I will leave 3 nuggets specific to air missile defense that has kind of fallen out of some of the work that our enterprise has done. 1, air missile defense must protect maneuver forces. Forces being plural, and not only the mounted platforms on the ground, the infantry, but our joint partners as well. Whether that's through fixed assets or semi-fixed assets, bottom line, protect the maneuver forces. Air missile defense must defend against complex integrated attacks. Not new doctrine, much of which we've talked to before, but some of the investments we have not had over the last couple of years have maybe atrophied some of the skills which have been talked to earlier. And I would argue that the financial investment, intellectual investment we have behind us now to include some of our new technologies is definitely going to push us to that end. And lastly, the air missile defense capabilities must converge to help the joint force create windows of superiority. We talked to that earlier. Converging all of our capabilities to a greater end, to a greater output. With that, sir, I'll yield the floor to you.
Great. Thank you, sir. Thank you, panel. And I know this is illegal, but you all stayed pretty much on time, and so I appreciate that. The first 2 questions I'm going to combine into one have to do with authorities. So I'll paraphrase from them, but one of the Missile Defense Review's tasks is an assessment of the roles, responsibilities, and authorities to optimize trans-regional integrated air and missile defense. What currently is working in that regard? What changes would you recommend? And then what challenges are there in getting the authorities that you need to execute air and missile defense in multi-domain operations? And I'll start with any of the AAMDC commanders first, and then if anybody else wants to pile on, please go ahead.
Hey, sir, thanks. And, as I said earlier, this is something we have, I think we collectively as an enterprise have done a pretty good job at. And I'll let each of the AAMDC certainly talk about their region. We have aggressively brought together our communities in the CENTCOM region with GCC conferences that we have the full backing of the CHODs led by General Votel, because that's where it really starts. The technical pieces out there, certainly we have to get some expertise on there and what we really want to foreign disclose. But we're in a pretty good position right now, particularly as we look at the reposture of the CENTCOM region. And, something that I'll just kind of share with you, and as I met with my Emirati partners just a little less than about 3 weeks ago, and he's indicated to me they've fired about 145 Patriot missiles over the last 3 years. And the Saudi Arabians would probably echo that similar amount. And something we have to really understand is they are combat proven, and they have been doing this stuff pretty seriously for a very long time. They have identified their gaps. They have looked at themselves very clearly, and while we may try to hyper-criticize from our Monday morning quarterback seats back here in the U.S., they understand where their shortcomings are, and they have asked us for help in certain areas that aren't necessarily technical, i.e. maintenance and sustainment, and these are areas that we can certainly continue to help them out with. And so I think we're in a pretty good position where we're at, and it's aggressively being led by the CFAC, who's charged myself and his the deputy of the Central Air Force Command to kind of lead this effort up. So I'll leave it at that, sir. Gentlemen.
Yeah, sure, if I may, and just to pile on where General Coward left off. It's a continuous conversation with General Walters, the Area Air Defense Commander. Obviously, my boss, Lieutenant General Cavoli, is very much concerned based on some of the O plans and where corps and divisions and those short-range air defense and those Patriot forces will fall out, and how they would support a respective corps or a respective division, and who in fact has those authorities. The biggest concern right now as we enter an exercise here in the next week or two is the pre-Article 5 and who owns those authorities. And as the former Deputy Commanding General USERA would state, it's going to be a coalition. It's going to be the U.S. and a coalition of the willing. So the question is, who's controlling fires, ID engagement authority, and then ultimately decision makers for engaging those targets, again, at a variety of echelons.
Thanks. Anybody else Frank, you want to comment? Please.
Our authorities are fairly set for Homeland Defense, and I think we're pretty happy with them right now. Cool.
And we're pleased about that. Okay, this question's for Colonel Welter. For air-based defense, is the Air Force looking at organic air defense capability to mitigate any shortfalls that there might be in the provision of Army AMD forces, or are you counting on Army AMD exclusively?
Well, I'm not going to be able to answer that specifically, but we're looking at, again, what I talked about earlier, and that what is a quiver that our potential adversaries have? What is that range? What's that portfolio of capabilities that we have to face, and how are we going to operate in an environment where we're facing that, especially if we're hit? And in that regard, who's responsible for air-based defense ultimately, especially at an air base, and how do we coordinate what's going on the air base? Because they're probably going to be joint. I mean, you look at a place like Guam or wherever else we're operating in the world, we have to make sure that we have adequate command and control coordination to that end. So these are some of the things for future force design that we're really looking hard at. right now. We're exploring that, what we need to do, and to that end, we've been in close conversation with the other services and our partners abroad to get to where we need to go in that regard. So, is it a layered defense? Multiple integrated systems. We don't know. We're working on that. We're getting to that point with regard to our future force design. So.
Great, thanks. You all touched on this a little bit, and General Brito commented on the need for it in his follow-on remarks. But it's not just the Army that requires or is facing SHORAD threats on the battlefield. What plans do we have to provide SHORAD capability or to share that with joint force partners and allies, and how do we train to that? I think that's probably an important question as well.
Sir, I'll take it broadly right now first, and then if you want to come back. So I'll just give it an example. There's a significant UAS threat against the Emiratis and the Saudi Arabians, and I can kind of speak about that, open press here. But what we have done is not necessarily provide capacity, but more so we've provided technical expertise and information sharing to provide them the early warning in order to thwart that threat in their countries as we see it emanate, and we have the early warning and the sensors that can provide that to them early, so that can get after some of the coalition piece, as well as how we're looking at this in joint operations as well in the CENTCOM region.
I think with 5480A and what Lieutenant General Cavoli, the U.S. Army Europe Commander, is working through is how do we leverage that capability in an effort to support the defeat of A2AD bubbles, and how do we leverage the short-range air defense, the surface-to-surface fires, USAFE assets that have, and NAVIR assets and so forth that have been mentioned, and how do we pair those capabilities together to bring the combined arms effort in an MDO environment. One way that we continue to work through this challenge with our allies and partners, and I failed to circle back in my opening comments, is through live fire exercises. It goes back to we're not going to do this alone, so there's no reason we should ever conduct a live fire exercise by ourselves. And it gets back after our greatest challenge, the interoperability piece. It gets after a tactical live fire exercise versus an administrative shoot within the realm of left and right limits, the safety and so forth, and the restraints that are placed on us. But why are we firing in June a Patriot live fire exercise at Capumidea in Romania? And why are we lined up next to Romanian Hawk missiles or Hawk launchers? Why are we firing short-range air defense capabilities up in Utsk, Poland, as well as down in Shabla, Bulgaria, side by side with our allies and our partners? It's extremely important. And again, no different than what we did coming out of JC-18. The capstone event was an Israeli, U.S. Patriot live fire with some Iron Dome mix in between. So that's another way we get after it.
And sir, if I can add it to the joint training that Colonel Shank illustrated very well. Increased efforts for joint education also, whether it's through the IMET program or just exercise exchanges for smaller periods of time, joint combat training centers within our U.S. joint forces, but also inviting our international partners as well. And across all of our centers, we're seeing that increase, which helps get to some of those capabilities and other capacity you have to have.
And I would just add for thought, and I've been long an advocate for talking about air and missile defense within the context of offense-defense integration. And both to the answer for Colonel Welter and to this last question, we're not going to solve all of the SHORAD threat problems with maneuver SHORAD and with air defense alone. It really is an offense-defense integration that's going to help reduce that threat, intercept and defeat that threat, and then retaliate against that threat and eventually eliminate it. So I would just add that for thought. Okay, a lot of questions on allied participation and integration. So I want to hit that, really two that I'm going to combine. But from your perspective, first of all, do allies and partners understand where we're headed with multi-domain operations, and with the permission of the author of the question, and I would add, and the role of air and missile defense in multi-domain operations, and do they see a role for themselves in that? And then the related question that I'll tie to it is, given all that, what changes might need to be made in the FMS process to increase allied capability? So, two-part question. I'll throw it open to the panel.
I guess since I'm the old guy, I'll start here. and please ask for the support of my teammates here. I'll take risks, sir, in saying yes sometimes. And recently learned you have to look at it through the eyes of our allied partner as well. And do they see the threat as we do? Do they see the future battle and operating environment as we do? And their participation as an allied partner in joint services as well as we do. So some aspects of the necessity of multi-domain operations will ring true in their eyes. Not good, bad, or neutral. Pick our Israeli partners as an example. Their threat is much closer to their backyard. So they may see some things, especially air defense, in a different light than we do. And with that, I'll phone a friend to my right and see what they may have to offer.
Hey, sir, I would tell you as well that your FMS component of the question there is they're very aware from the CENTCOM perspective of their capabilities, understanding where they need to upgrade and improve and to define their requirements. And it's really to the help of all you ladies and gentlemen out here, not necessarily in uniform still, that started that. And that's important as we can't hide anything from them. They're very smart, and we're not going to try to fool them with limitations on the capabilities that they see us receive, particularly in our Patriot and our THAAD force, and they have an understanding of what IBCS means to the fight. And so as they see us go after requirements in the high 2020s, they are already starting to ask these questions. And it's incumbent upon us as we continue to send our training and fielding teams to these regions to integrate them with them early and continuously. Thank you.
Just real quick to add on, so I would ask a question to your question, and that is, do we necessarily understand what multi-domain operations really mean to us? And that's something, again, that we've discussed in AFWIC quite a bit in exploring what our future design should look like. And we've done it with our joint partners and our partners abroad. It's one of those things that I think we're still refining, and we need to articulate or have that discussion here at home and be on that journey with our partners moving forward.
Yeah, I'd just like to add 30 seconds. I agree with General Brito, and I agree with Colonel Welter. Sometimes we need to look in the mirror ourselves and recognize that maybe we're not as good as we think we are. And you don't have to look too far to recognize that Syria was a heck of a test bed in 16 and 17 for the Russians, and the number of pieces of equipment, kinetic and non-kinetic, that were, dare I say, test-fired successfly in that country. Do our partners, and allies, do they clearly understand it? I think some of the times, but I think no different than Colonel Shank. I'll just speak for myself, that sometimes you can lose sight of it until suddenly you're unable to transmit on a radio and things of that nature, and very quickly open your eyes.
And I would just add, that's one of the advantages and benefits of having seminars or sessions like this, where we have a chance to talk about multi-domain ops and get to understand it, get to understand how different capability areas are going to integrate in it. And as General Brown talked about, going from concept to doctrine rather rapidly, that should help provide clarity. Next question again for the panel, from a multi-domain perspective. Can you discuss any capability needs and gaps that you have that you think need to be filled so that we can better integrate air and missile defense across the multi-domains? Any capability gaps? Tom, you want to take a shot at that?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I took a foot stomp on the missile defense review, because even though it waves a hand in the direction of integrated air and missile defense, it really remains a ballistic missile defense heavy document. And the reason I'm emphasizing this is I worry that there's not going to be sufficient attention to air defense. And so from the high policy level, there's just not enough of that. And so it's wonderful to see those overlapping and layered charts, IFPC and Patriot, IFPC and MSHORAD, things like that. But I think from the big perspective, I see air defense and element force protection as being a giant vulnerability.
Okay, question on the network coordination required for multi-domain ops and the need to have perfected that in training. Maybe you want to start with this, Clem, because the roving sands probably give you an opportunity to talk to it, but any challenges or issues with putting that network in place, exercising it in training, and being ready for multi-domain ops?
Yeah, much better at it. And the goodness is we've been operating, we, the air defense community, have been operating in a I call it a static joint network for a pretty long time. The challenges are some of the things that General Dickinson presented earlier. When you're working with Blue Force Track and when you're working with satellite that's providing you information on the move is critical. And I would tell you that this is something that I go back to Chris Billman, who AAR'd last year's event, saying we just didn't train enough in this environment. And to kind of go to your last question, but certainly even right now, this is something that we have to get back into. I go back to warfighters, MCTP, BCTP type environments, because we don't have a set structure that we can be part of, and we have to get ourselves embedded back into those operations and exercises.
Sir, if I may add to that, it's using my grunt terms, the interoperability required of those who you're supporting. So the air missile defense may be supporting or protecting a brigade combat team or another formation. And do you have the technical interoperability, but also the SOPs and stuff that come out of these exercises as well, where all the plugs work, but do I know how to use them? And so that's something also a big benefit that comes out of these exercises. And the requirements we lay out as well helps facilitate that end.
And that question for me brought to mind your comment on your opening slide about the nexus of the modernization priorities that the Army established. And so it's not air and missile defense in a vacuum. It's air and missile defense. It's long-range precision fires. It's the network. And so bringing all that together so that we can execute air and missile defense within the context of missile defense, or excuse me, multi-domain operations. This is, I don't know if this was an honor of General McQuistion or just because she's sitting here, but someone asked the question, what are some of the logistical challenges? I'm drawing on your, can you imagine that? We're talking about air and missile defense, and now we're going to bring, what are some of the logistical challenges that you may face as you try to implement missile defense operations within multi-domain ops? And you must have learned any of those lessons at Roving Sands and in Europe. Go ahead, Dave.
Yeah, I'll tell you the first one that was recognized that I know of in 2017 was the interoperability in rail cars. That you go from one country to another, and they don't connect. Simply put, so I know 21st Theater Sustainment Command and Major General Shapiro, he had a fit with that, and between the interoperability of rail cars, but also through the Schengen zones that either exist or don't exist, and the pausing at the borders and so forth. That's probably the first one that jumps out at me.
Hey, real quick, ma'am, and I don't know if you asked that question or not, but it's an expeditionary mindset. Once again, our maintenance companies that are direct support of our Patriot battalions, once again, have been in this environment, and so now they understand that, how do they sustain forward? How do we have line haul capability that can move equipment and large equipment forward? How do we coordinate with CSSBs? And that's something we were able to capitalize on even just during Roving Sands. We have the Texas National Guard out there, phenomenal organization that's going through their stand-up as they train to get ready. And so this is a good opportunity to get after that, sir.
Sorry, any of the panel members want to offer a closing thought before I turn it over to the panel chair?
Sure, why not?
I knew you would.
It took me about 6 months to recognize in the seat that there was no AMD engagement strategy in Europe. And that's not a poke in anybody's eyeballs, but very quickly, and again, I circle back to the initiatives group that's been stood up, and specifically the FA-59 and our formation, a former field artilleryman, I might add, and the products that they've put together with some left and right limits focused on interoperability and operational depth. It's a guide. It helps us identify where we need to go, what country we need to be in, and when we need to be there. So I think that is worth mentioning. Thank you.
Sir, can I just ask pose a question? And that is, we hear a lot about 10x capability boost. I would kind of raise the question, what is the way, this is to cost imposition, that we can have 10x passive defense, and especially 10x passive defense for our active air defenses, really about air survivability? I would suggest a part of that answer is going to come from giving them 10 times more targets through a variety of means, and then also what the NDS calls operational unpredictability. But I think that question hasn't gotten enough attention. I just want to put it on the table.
Great, thanks. Joe Brito.
Sir, for one, thank you for the opportunity. It's always great to talk about warfighting, because at the end of the day, that's what we're going to do. And we need to help our Army and our joint force be the best they can at it. The clear definition of the expanded battlefield and this new concept, our new operating environment, the technology and the modernization that our pacing threats have already done and continue to do, clearly demand the A game and all this air missile defense. So, sir, thank you for the opportunity. This is both collectively and personally beneficial, and I know we're going to get at it. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Let me just close with a couple of comments. First, again, thanks to AUSA for hosting this great forum and for the series of hot topics, and to General Dickinson and SMDC for supporting the effort. I'd like to thank the audience here and on WebEx for your participation, for your attention, and most importantly, for your thoughtful questions. And I'd like to thank the panel members for their preparation, for their comments, and for their thoughtful answers to those thoughtful questions. I always like to close by reminding ourselves that while we're here talking about air and missile defense and multi-domain operations and how we're going to employ it, it's the soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, and civilians who develop, deploy, and operate those air and missile defense systems that this ultimately falls on. It is to them that we owe our greatest thanks and appreciation and our support. And I thank them, and I thank you all. Thanks.